Alright, so we are in the garage today with the CRX, and today we are going to be servicing the brakes. We've got an 88, which means drum brakes on the rear, and disc brakes on the front. So this is fairly applicable to Civics, as Civics have drum brakes in the rear for all years. Later years, CRX got disc brakes in the rear, so the procedure for disc brakes in the rear is going to be pretty similar to the disc brakes in the front. So just kind of follow along if you have newer CRX with disc brakes in the rear, and just kind of apply the same methodology to the rear. So brake jobs are a little bit more involved than your typical oil change, oil filter change. So we just want to make sure we have everything on hand before we get too carried away. So first off, we need a way to get the car in the air. I've got a jack and jack stands, and preferably we'll have all four tires in the air at the same time, which means that we're going to need 4 jack stands. Next up, we've got gloves. So brake work's kind of messy, so I like to use gloves in this case. I have face masks here. So disc brakes, whenever you take the drum off, there's a bunch of brake dust and rust and dirt and all this kind of nasty stuff. So make sure, well, it's up to you, but really highly recommend having a face mask. We're going to need screwdrivers for this job. And then I have these diagonal cutters, which will come in handy for the drum brakes, or a pair of needle nose pliers. Next we have this flare and wrench here. So it differs from your typical wrench. It's kind of like a box end, but it can pass over brake lines. We've got a standard socket set. And then with brakes, we're going to be bleeding the system today. So it's just me in the garage today. I don't have an assistant. So if you're working on your own, you're going to need some method of bleeding the brakes on your own. I use this power bleeder, but you can look up a couple different ways to bleed the brakes on your own. Next up, we've got penetrating oil. So brake systems, they like to seize on a little bit. This might help us get some stubborn parts off. We'll also want brake parts cleaner for cleaning up our new rotors and cleaning up any brake fluid, which also means we're going to need a lot of paper towels. And then I'm going to use this impact wrench to just make things a little bit easier on myself. Now before you get too carried away, we've covered the tools you need, but let's just make sure you have all of the correct parts before getting into the job. So I've got new rotors here, new brake pads for the front, so that's 4, 2 for each side. So for the drums I have 2 new shoes. And then I've got shoes for each side. I have wheel cylinders, 1 for each side. And then I have a new brake hardware kit. So it actually isn't labeled. But you'll pretty much want to use a new brake hardware kit instead of trying to reuse the old kit. So let's get this thing in the air, and we'll start taking off some wheels and we'll take a look. Alright, so we got the car off the ground now on all 4 jack stands. And if you don't have an impact wrench, then I recommend breaking the lug nuts first before you get the car off the ground, because otherwise it's really difficult to get the lug nuts off with the car in the air. And one thing is check your jack stands and make sure they're level. So I see this one here is a little bit crooked, so I'm going to get that one straightened out before I start working underneath the car, just to make sure that it's not going to collapse on me. Alright, so first off what we need to do is we need to get the caliper rotated out of here to get our brake pads out. And then once the caliper rotates out, we can slide it off. So to make all of this happen, there's this bolt down here, which is, I believe, a 12mm. So we're just going to take this guy off really quick and then get this caliper out. So this bolt is being difficult, so first brake, we're already pulling out the penetrating oil. So we're going to get this bolt on the bottom, and then there's these 2 screws on the rotor, or that keep the rotor in place. So let's get a little bit of penetrating oil in there to help these screws get out. There's this bracket that holds the caliper in place. So on the back side there are 2 17mm bolts, which they're a little bit difficult to get to with the caliper in place. So let's see if we can just get a spot of penetrating oil on these guys. And I'll bring you in for a look. Let's just get right on those. So the difficulty with getting penetrating oil on this bolt is it actually passes all the way through this rubber boot, and then the threads are in here. So you actually kind of want to focus on the other side of the boot to get the threads with oil, and not on the head of the bolt. While that penetrating oil is setting in, just take a mental note of where these clips are. So we've got the small clip on the bottom for the brake pad, then we've got the larger clip on the top. So we just want to keep in mind how those clips go back on for when we're putting everything back together. So what happens with the bolt out of there is the caliper now rotates up and out of the way. So rotate it up and out of the way, and then let's bring you around here. There's a pin that leads from this bracket out that the caliper pivots around. So now that we have the caliper rotated up and out, it slides off of the pin. Just like so. So now what we need to be careful of is the brake line. So we've got the caliper attached to the brake line, but we don't want to just let go of the caliper because it puts a lot of weight on this brake line. So some people, they use bungee cords to support the caliper, and they just kind of hang it off of the upper control arm somewhere up in here. But what I do is I usually just balance it over here on the radius rod. So I play it a little risky. I don't necessarily recommend doing what I do here, but I balance it on the radius rod. You just have to be careful not to bump it, or else it can slide off and put tension on this brake line. So with the caliper out of the way, we have two 17mm bolts, one on the top and then one on the bottom. So those hold this bracket in place, but with the caliper out, what we can do is pull the brake pads out like so. So it looks like these were actually done relatively recently. A lot of meat left on the pad, but they don't break that well. So that's why we're doing the upgrade today. Okay, so the bracket bolts are actually being pretty stubborn, so I'm going to go for these screws while those bracket bolts sit in penetrating oil. Now one problem we have is as I try to release these screws, the rotor and the spindle are all rotating together. So I'm going to use my breaker bar, and I'm just going to brace it in here like so. And then this will help to catch the threads. Oops. Alright, so before getting too carried away trying to get these screws out, you want to make sure you have the right screwdriver bit. So this is a Phillips head. I don't know if you can read that. Probably not. But this is a Phillips head 3 size. If you use the wrong size, you have a higher risk of stripping out the screw. So let's get the 3 size in here. And they've been sitting with the penetrating oil for a little bit. So let's see if this is enough to get it out of there. I ended up getting the screws out, but what I had to do is I just had to use my mallet and tap on the screwdriver a little bit. That seemed to help break the screws loose just a little bit. And then on my bracket, which is no longer present, is those bolts. I ended up using the impact wrench on those. So if you have a breaker bar, perhaps you can get enough leverage in here to get those loose, but the impact wrench is what helped me out with there. So a little bit tricky with these bolts since they're sitting right in all of the water that gets kicked up from the road and dirt and heat. But at this point, we are now ready to get our rotor out of here and then get our new rotor in. So let's go ahead and do that now. One thing I've neglected to do in this step is it's important that you clean the face that the rotor sits on, because otherwise some of that dirt and rust that builds up on there can cause the rotor to not sit perfectly flat, and then it'll lead to the brakes vibrating. So in putting the new rotor into place, you want to be careful not to touch the braking surface, so try to just either hold it by the outside here or the inner diameter. Now it looks like these EBC brakes I got have some type of special coating on the rotor that I think wears off after the first couple of brakes, so it might be some break-in material. But what you normally want to do is, most rotors are cut on a lathe, and they have cutting fluid and a special protective fluid on the surface to keep the rotor from rusting. So what you want to do is you just want to spray a little bit of brake fluid on your rotors and clean up that surface just a little bit before installing the brake pads. So I'm going to do that really quickly and suggest doing the same on your end. Alright, so let's go ahead and reinstall our screws to get this rotor in place. So with the rotors, you'll notice there's two holes that are basically just passed straight through, and then there's two that have this chamfer. So these screws have this conic shape to them, so you want to make sure that you get these screw holes aligned with the holes in the spindle, because these are what locate the brake hub. If you were to put it on here, the screws would be biting at a weird angle. So you just want to make sure that you get those located correctly. Okay, so at this point we'll get our bracket back into position. So the way the bracket goes on is it sits over the rotor with this little notch in here. Let's just clean up our bracket a little bit before getting it in. And then when putting your bracket on and installing these bolts, there's this washer that you want to make sure you have in place, otherwise it'll sit too far in and rub on the rotor. So just make sure you have that washer in place. Okay, so with the bracket securely in place, we want to now clean this post off, get it nice and debris free. That rhymes. And then once we do that, we're going to just coat a little bit of brake grease on here, because the caliper needs to slide back and forth just a little bit on this pin. And so if it's dirty or if there's no grease, eventually it'll bind on here, which will cause the caliper to drag. So we just want to make sure that we get this nice and clean and greased up. I bought this tube of brake parts lubricant, and you want to make sure that you get brake parts lubricant because other lubricants can break down in the heat, so brakes get very, very hot. So you just want to make sure you get something rated for the heat that brakes experience. What I'll do is I'll just coat a little bit on the pen there. And now what I'll do is I'll just kind of follow along with a paper towel here and just kind of rub that around. I don't want the grease to be too thick, so we'll just use this to get a nice light layer on the pen without getting any on the rotor, because grease and rotors don't mix, because you need this to grab, and if you have grease, it's going to lubricate. Doesn't really work out. So at this stage, what we'll do is we'll get our new pads installed, and as I mentioned earlier, you want to make sure with your brake hardware that it's in place and in the correct position. So I've got my brake hardware in place, and now we can get our pad located in here. Alright, so you just want to make sure you get it lined up correctly. And, whoop. This will likely take a couple of tries to get everything lined up. So it can be tempting to just toss this hardware away, since it's kind of difficult to get everything lined up. But you want to avoid doing so because you need these in place, or else the brake pads will move around in the caliper and they'll make this clunking noise, and it'll also cause excessive wear. So you just want to make sure you get these guys in place and just wrestle with it until you can get it in there. Looks like we got this one in. Now we just need to come around to the back and to get that one in. Alright, so we got brake pads in place inside of the bracket. We've got rotor installed. So now all we have to do is put our caliper back on. Now I just want to take a second to note that while I'm installing new these aren't calipers. while I'm installing new rotors, it is possible to reuse your old rotors, but in order to do so, what you need to do is you need to take your rotors to get turned. So what that means is that they put it on a lathe and they get the rotor spinning around, and they use a cutting tool to cut away the surface here to expose fresh metal for the brake pads to bite into. Now, if you don't do either turning the rotors or installing new rotors, what will happen is that the brake pads will be squeezing against the rotor, but they won't really be biting into the surface. So that means that your braking will be compromised. Now, there is a limit to how far you can machine your existing rotors, and this information can be found in the manual. Sometimes it's printed into the rotor itself, but really the cost to get a rotor turned is about 50% of just buying a new rotor. So it just makes sense to buy new rotors anyways, but it's your judgment call. Now we're going to be getting our caliper into position, but before we do that, what you want to do is you want to put a little bit of grease on the back of the pads where the caliper will be contacting the pads. So where the piston bites on this one, and then the backing plate on this one. And the reason for this is you want something in there to absorb some of the vibration. So if you don't put anything in, what will happen is you'll get a little bit of squealing when you brake. So by putting this material in, you can avoid some of that. So you just put a light coat of grease on here. So we got our caliper kind of in position, but what we need to do is we need to push the piston back in because it was pushed out for the old pads which had worn down. So we just need to push it back just a little bit to clear the new pads which have more material. Alright, so what I want to do is I'm going to use the old pad in here to press against the piston. And you can see I've got the C-clamp around that piston and everything, so I'm just going to give this a light press just to push that piston back in. I've just got this guy for the bottom, although the threads are pretty nasty. I'm just going to clean that up with a little bit of brake cleaner. Maybe you can see. And then what I'll do, I'll just put a little dab of grease on these threads to act as anti-seize. So next time we're doing the brakes, it'll just come off of there a little bit easier. And I'll just use my paper towel to distribute that a little bit. So just get a nice light coat of grease on there. Now let's put that in. Alright, so that's one of the front sides done. Now what you want to do just really quick before you get everything buttoned up is you just want to check this dust guard, and we just want to make sure we didn't accidentally bend it into the rotor. So I'm just going to make sure it's just pushed out of the way, and I'll just turn it by hand and just make sure that it's not rubbing, so we look good there. Alright, so I'm going to go get that other side done, and I'll show you the finished results over there, and then once I get that finished, we're going to go on to the back. Alright, so at this point we're ready to start working on the rear, but at this point I recommend getting a face mask and wearing this. So let's get the face mask on, and then also a pair of safety glasses. The reason I say that is with drum brakes, the drum itself can capture a lot of the brake dust, and it doesn't really have anywhere to go. So when you pull this off, there's going to be a ton of brake rust, or brake dust, and rust, and contaminants, just all kinds of stuff kind of caked in here. Well, the first thing we need to do is we need to go disengage the parking brake, because with the parking brake it's pushing against the shoe, so it's going to keep us, or the drum, so it's going to keep us from pulling it off. So with the parking brake disengaged, hopefully this will just pull right off. If not, you might have to manipulate it a little bit to pull it off. There's also these two holes here that are threaded. So what you can do is you can take a bolt and thread it into here. And when you do so, that'll help to press this drum off of here. Alright, so I was able to pull off my drum by just kind of working it a little bit and just pulling it off. Depending on how old your drums are, they might put up a bit more of a fight, so you'll just have to get creative. Like I said, you can use those bolt holes. Now at this point, you have two options on what you can do. Here we have the rear spindle for the rear wheels, and it's a little bit difficult working on the drum brakes with this in place. So you can remove this if you want to. So if you want to remove the hub assembly to make it easy to work on the drum brake, what you need to do is remove this dust shield here that's protecting the nut. And when you do so, at that point, it's as easy as just taking off that nut. However, I say it's as easy as, but it's probably going to be pretty difficult depending on how old it is. And it's torqued to above 100 foot-pounds of torque. When you do break it loose, it does just slide right off. So with the dust cover off, the axle nut gets staked in here. So we just need to unstake this really quick so that we can remove it, because otherwise it'll get caught up in there just a little bit. Alright, so this is a 32mm bolt, and I'm going to try the impact wrench here, see if that will work for this, but we might have to resort to the breaker bar. Oh, that worked pretty well. So there's this little washer in here. You just want to make sure that you don't lose that. That helps to apply force to the spindle. With the hub assembly off now, you can see kind of what we're dealing with. So what you want to do is you want to just take a good visual snapshot of what this looks like, or even take a picture of it just so you don't forget. Might be a good idea. So when we go to reassemble this, you just want to make sure you get all of the parts in their correct positions. Otherwise, of course, the brakes won't work, and that'll be a bad thing. Okay, so our first step is going to be removing these retaining springs. So this pin, or this little feature here, is actually a pin that goes around to the back. So what you need to do is just press on the spring just a little bit. Doesn't look like your traditional spring, but it's a clip more like. So you just want to apply a little bit of pressure here, so when we remove this, it doesn't go flying into our face. Alright, so it didn't go flying too bad. And then this will just push through the back. So this is that clip, or the pin we just removed. Now we'll do the same on the other side. Alright, so with those two removed, we can kind of remove the assembly here. It has these retaining features on the bottom, so you kind of have to, and then the wheel cylinder has a slot, so you kind of slide it out of the wheel cylinder, and then that'll allow it to slide out usually. And there's really no perfect way to do this. I kind of take the whole thing out as an assembly, and then I try to get it back in as an assembly. Or you can take off all the springs before you remove it. It's really kind of up to you. Okay, so I have it all out of here as an assembly now. And then on this back end, we have our parking brake cable. Alright, so that's our bottom spring. We'll just get this guy for the self-adjuster. So one tip sometimes is, instead of needle nose pliers, what you can do in disassembling it is use diagonal cutters instead. So with that sharp edge, it just helps to grab a little bit better so it doesn't go flying off like the needle nose will do sometimes. Now in this case, what's causing some of our troubles is this is the self-adjusting mechanism in here. So every time you push on the brakes, it pushes the shoes out against the drum. And then this little clip here, what it does is it will spin this little feature in here. So that's threaded, and as the shoes wear down and it presses out, this little latching mechanism will spin the thread and push this bar out. So in this case, with the shoes being a little bit worn down, you can see that the mechanism has engaged a little bit. So that's putting tension in all of these springs. So taking some of that tension off will potentially help you. So you just have to play with it a little bit to remove all the springs, get everything separated. So our goal is, actually we don't want to remove the cable from this. What we need to do is we just need to remove the whole mechanism from the shoe. So you can see there's this pin, or this retaining feature in here. It's not a pin, it's a clip, that's keeping this brake, parking brake mechanism in there. So we just need to remove the auto adjust feature from here, and then that will allow us to get this thing out. Alright, so a little shot of brake fluid cleaner freed up some of the brake dust from here. So you can see now I'm getting it to spin freely. Alright, so once you get the two springs out on the top and the bottom, it'll basically just fall right apart. So you can see now we just have the trailing shoe here left with the brake assembly. So now what we need to do is get this clip out of here. And then once this clip is out, that'll allow the shoe to come off of here. You just kind of have to get creative with trying to get this little horseshoe off. So you have to basically separate it and then push it off. So what seemed to work pretty well is to get the horseshoe spun around with the fat part facing down and the two ends facing under this little lip. And then with the screwdriver underneath the lip, I was able to pry it up like so. And it takes a little bit of patience to get it in there, which I ran out of, to be honest. But doing so, I was able to get it over the pin just enough that I can now get on this side of it and finish prying it off. So, alright. So you got the horseshoe off, and then you just have to press the pin through, and then it'll come apart. Now, what ended up happening, I said that you could take this off with the parking brake cable still in place, but what ended up happening to me is it actually just ended up falling off on its own. So I guess just kind of play around with it, see what you can get accomplished. But now that we have the thing finally assembled, disassembled, what you want to do is clean up the surfaces on the stationary part here. And then we're also going to be replacing the brake cylinder. Now, why I replaced the brake cylinders is the bleeder valves on here are so thin that when you try to bleed the brakes after it's been sitting for a long time, it gets rusted and you ended up stripping off that bolt or even shearing it off. So I just want to replace the wheel cylinders and be done with it. And I've heard some people say that if you don't replace the wheel cylinders when servicing the brakes, what will end up happening is eventually the pneumatics in here will fail, and that'll cause the wheel cylinder to shake a little bit when you hit the brakes. So we're just going to get this replaced really quick. To do so there's two bolts on the back, and then there's also the brake line here. So we need a flare end wrench to get this brake line off. Now, when you do remove the wheel cylinder, what you want to be careful of is when you remove the brake line, it's going to start dribbling fluid all over the place. So you have to kind of work quick to get the new wheel cylinder in place, so that way you're not leaking too much brake fluid. You also just want to have a drip pan, not plan. Well, I guess a drip pan works too. So you want to have a drip pan in place to catch fluid on here so you're not spilling all over the place. So that's our next step, and then after that we'll be ready to start putting the shoe back in, which is again a huge pain. So before I remove the brake line, I'm just going to make sure that I can get this loose. There we go, just like that. So I just want to make sure that I can get the old brakes or wheel cylinder out of here really quick and get the new one in so I can get the brake line on. So when you go to put the new wheel cylinder on, you want to make sure that you get the bleeder valve on top. And the reason for that is when we go to bleed this, we want all of the air bubbles to come to the top of the wheel cylinder. If we're on the bottom, then all of the air bubbles will get trapped in the airline. So we just want to make sure we get that on top. And then when we go to put this in, the wheel cylinders come with a plug to keep contaminants out. So first of all, we want to make sure that we have a clean work environment so we don't get any dust or contaminants into our wheel cylinder. And then we also just want to make sure to keep this plug in until we're ready to plug the brake line on. Just make things all nice and clean. So you can see there's a small trickle of brake fluid there. So with the brake line on there now, I'm going to clean up the brake fluid. So brake fluid is really corrosive to paint, so we just want to get all that brake fluid that we just spilled all over the place out of here, so that way it doesn't eat away at our brake, which is on here as a rust protector. Alright, so with our wheel cylinder in, I'll just take you here. So what I was talking about when you were looking on the other side about sealing that gap is there's a gap in here until you get your wheel cylinder tightened down, and then as you tighten it down it'll seal that gap off, so that'll just keep any water and contaminants from getting inside of the drum brake and making a mess of things. So one thing to mention is now that we have our new wheel cylinder on, what we want to do is do not push the brakes at all. This is the no push brake time until we get everything reassembled and we get our drum back into place. The reason why is the wheel cylinder works by pressing out, and that forces the shoes into the drum. But if you press on the brakes without any resistance here, the wheel cylinder will just pop out and blow at the seals. So just avoid pushing the brakes until you get everything buttoned up again. So at this point we're ready to begin reassembling things, and hopefully, like I said earlier, you had a picture or something to go off of, or a mental image of how it goes back together. So let's get into it. Now before we start getting things in here completely, what we want to do is continue cleaning up. So just get any brake fluid that might have spilled, we'll do in the wheel cylinder. And also there's these 6 pads around the circumference of the drum. So we just want to make sure those are nice and clean. Our parking brake clean. So just a little bit of brake fluid on there. Paper towels do the trick. Okay. Now what we want to do is we'll take apart this adjuster and we'll just clean it up a little bit as well. Because for the adjuster to work, everything has to move freely without any binding. So we'll just clean up these threads, clean up inside of here. We'll clean up this end piece. Okay, so now that we have this thing nice and clean, what we'll do is we'll just get some brake fluid lubricant in here, because this needs to spin freely. Spin, that's a word. Just get a little dab in there. Alright, now what I'll do, we'll just get this in here. Well, it's convenient to do so. So we have the emergency brake back into position here. So to start reassembly, we'll start with the emergency brake onto our new shoe. So it's going to go something like this. So we need to get our old pin, and while we're at it, might as well just clean that guy up too. So we will get that into position. And we'll drop the pin through the 2 parts. Actually, I'll get it through the drum or the shoe first. So now, just get that guy in here. And like so, got that in there. So as I mentioned earlier, you want to be using new hardware. So I've got my new little pin in here. So I'm going to press that over the pin like so. It's probably not going to be as easy as I hope. So you just get that pin pressed all the way up, And then what you need to do is you need to grab the pin, or the clip, I keep saying pin, grab the clip and pinch it together, and that will seal the pin onto our assembly. So we have our clip clipped in now around our pin. So that's going to go in here like so. Kind of like that. But before getting too carried away, what I want to do is grease these 6 pads around here. Just apply a little bit of lubricant so that way when the shoes are on here they have flexibility to move around without rubbing on that too much. Alright, so at this point you just have to try to get everything back into here, so it's going to be a lot of juggling to get all the pieces together. Sometimes what works for me is assembling the shoes together with all the springs and then kind of sliding it into position. Or sometimes you can try to just put the clips back onto the shoes to hold them in place, and then you can try to put all the springs on. Really, it's just kind of trial and error, see what works for you. Refer back to hopefully the picture you took earlier, or I'll take a video of it once everything's put back together just to show you how it goes back together. Okay, so here we are with the finished product. And on your end, you just want to go through and make sure that everything's correct. So you have the bottom spring passing through on that bracket. You have the parking brake cable passing through on the top side of the bracket and still connected to the lever on that side. And then your top spring, it goes into the top notches on the shoes here. The self-adjusting mechanism, you want to make sure it's in the shoe and then also attached to that lever there. And then this kind of fork, you just want to make sure it's pressed into the shoe correctly. I had some difficulties that it didn't press in, but you just want to make sure that's correct. And then you have the spring going into the shoe and around the self-adjustment mechanism, and then your retaining clips are correct. And then just double check that your shoes pass through the slot on the wheel cylinder, and that should be it. You should be ready to put your hub assembly back on and then put the drum on. So before installing the drum, one thing you need to do is just kind of pre-adjust the adjusting mechanism. So you just need to put a little bit of pre-tension on there, and I'll show you here in a second what we're shooting for. So when you're pressing on the drum, you probably have to move the shoes around just a little bit to get it to pass over. Once you do get it on there, what you want to do is just kind of spin the drum. And ideally you want it to spin about 1 revolution on its own before it stops. If it spins more than that, you don't have enough pre-tension, and if it spins less, you have too much pre-tension, so you'll just have to adjust that mechanism. If there's too much slack in there, when you hit the brake pedal, there'll be a lot of travel in the brake pedal because you have to get the wheel cylinder to expand to press up against this. And that pretty much dictates for the whole system what the brake pedal travel is going to be. So you just want to make sure you get that adjusted until you're about to this point. And I lucked out that when I got that on here, it was just enough. So we're going to call that good for this side. I'm going to go work on the other side, get that finished up, and then we'll get this brake job finished up after that. So I'll see you in a little bit once I get that done. To help adjust on the back side of the drum is this little pass-through that you can use to reach that self-adjusting screw. So once you have the drum on there, that's probably what you want to use to adjust the drum so you're not taking off the drum every time. Alright, so I've got this side done. So that's both rear drums finally finished. Unfortunately, I don't really have any tips to make this any easier. It's just kind of trial and error to find what works and how to juggle all the parts and get them mounted correctly. And any tips I thought I would share, every time I do this, whatever worked last time didn't work the next time. So, like I said, it's just something you have to kind of wrestle with and exercise patience to finally get it on there. But now that we have the rear and the front finally finished, At this point we are ready to bleed the brakes. So to bleed the brakes, what you want to do is you want to come to the fluid reservoir, brake fluid reservoir, and what we want to do is we want to be putting fresh fluid into here, and then once we have fresh fluid in there, well, we have to kind of flush out some of this here. You could use a syringe to take out some of this dirty stuff so you're not running it through the lines, but since I did the wheel cylinders, those are going to be full of air anyways, so it's kind of up to you if you want to flush out the dirty stuff with using a syringe to pull it out and then put in clean fluid that you then bleed through the rest of the system. What we'll be doing is coming to the bleeder valves on the calipers and the rear of the car, and what you do is, well, there's a couple of different ways. You can pressurize the system by having an assistant pump the brakes for you, and then after they pump it a couple times, hold the pedal down, and then attaching a hose onto here, you crack the valve and fluid will come out, and then once the fluid has come out, you retighten the valve, and then at that point your assistant can let go of the brakes. This method's kind of tedious. So what I have here is I have this little handheld power, or well, yeah, kind of power, brake bleeding vacuum pump kit. So this allows you to do it on your own rather easily. But there's a lot of helpful videos out there on how to bleed the brakes, either by yourself or with an assistant. So I recommend looking at a couple of those. But at this point, let's start bleeding the brakes. Alright, and then when you bleed the brakes, there's a very specific order, at least according to the service manual. So the fluid level in the reservoir will begin to drop. So just make sure that you always have adequate fluid in there to keep from air getting into the lines. Okay, so after bleeding the brakes and you begin to get clear fluid through the lines without any air bubbles, just be sure to tighten your cap on your reservoir after making sure the fluid level is where it's supposed to be. And then give your brake pedals a couple of test pumps. So when I did so, I found that there is still kind of excessive travel pedal. So I just kind of went through and did another round of brake bleeding. So you just want to make sure those are both correct before going too far and going and driving on the street. Another thing to do is after you test the brake pedal a couple of times, just look for leaks. So it turns out my bleeder valve was leaking on that caliper, so I just had to go tighten it up again and clean up some of that brake fluid. Okay, so at this point we're pretty much wrapped up with this project. So just triple check your fluid reservoir, make sure the cap is on and that your fluid is correct. And then just kind of go around, like I said, and check for leaks and just make sure that everything is correct. But at that point, you're pretty much ready to put on your tires and go for a test drive. But the thing about going for a test drive is the braking performance will be compromised for a while. So there's a coating on rotors, on brake rotors, that you have to eat through with the pads. And then the same thing for the drums in the rear. So when you go out and drive, each brake rotor and brake pad combination will have its own specific instructions. So just follow the instructions that come with your rotors, but kind of the default is definitely make sure that you have enough following distance and avoid emergency braking for the first 100 miles. And what you also want to do is bed the brakes. So the way you do that is you start at about 60 miles per hour and then slow down to about 20 miles per hour with firm pressure, but you don't want to lock up the brakes or anything. But you just want to do that probably about 5 times. That way the brake pads can create a nice surface for themselves on the rotors. But other than that, you're pretty much done with the project. Alright, so one thing we want to do is, since we had the drum brakes apart and we replaced the shoes and everything, we just want to check our parking brake operation. So after pumping the brakes a couple of times, the self-adjuster should adjust the tension on the springs in the rear. So what we would just want to check is we pull up on the parking brake. Let's go check to see if the wheels are actually locked with the car in the air. come in here, see if it's locked, and same with the other side. Looks good. Now, changing the drums and shoes and everything, you shouldn't change the parking brake function. And what I mean by that is how many clicks it takes to engage. So if we go like that, it shouldn't change that. But if you want to make an adjustment, the way you do that is, first of all, just come here and we'll recline or get the front seat out of the way. And then back here is this cover. So underneath of this cover, there's just a single 12mm bolt. So you would take off this cover and you would adjust that until you get the appropriate number of clicks, which is between 5 and 7 clicks is where you want to be. So that would just be how you adjust that, but with changing the brakes, you shouldn't need to, and you only adjust that when the cable gets stretched. So hopefully you found this video helpful, and if there's any questions you have or anything that was unclear, just let me know, and hopefully we can help you out, or somebody else can help you out. So just make sure to comment and then get your questions out in the open. And if you did find the video helpful, consider liking and subscribing to stay up to date on the CRX or further how-to videos on these cars. But as always, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you next time.
See you again.